Excuse me. After the neoclassicals came along, there were a very influential set of economists who we might call the welfare economists. And this was a set of economists who kind of, if you think about the classicals as being a very macro view, and then the neoclassicals as being a micro view, well, then the welfare economists were sort of playing both sides. They still looked at things from an individual decision-making consideration. In other words, they're still looking at individual consumers and individual producers. However, they're casting economic markets within this concept of social welfare. Okay, social welfare. When we say welfare economists, what we're talking about is economists who are interested in the sort of social prosperity of economic growth. In other words, instead of just looking at economic growth, or instead of just looking at individual decision making, look at what economic growth is doing to individual decision making and how that is therefore leading to increases in human welfare, increases in human prosperity. So these economists are Pareto, John Hicks, Kaldor, and Kenneth Arrow. And from them, we have what we now call the first and second fundamental welfare theorems of economics. I mean, these are in many respects the most important sort of economic concepts of the 20th and 21st centuries, because they've really driven policy decisions much the same way that the classical economists and neoclassical economists drove decisions during their time as well. So these are some very important economists with some very important ideas, and again, much like the marginalists, much like the neoclassicals, ideas that we're going to use within this class to cast these environmental issues. The first fundamental welfare theorem is really the sort of crux of the free market argument. And it says that competitive markets, otherwise called free markets, lead to Pareto optimality under neoclassical assumptions. So first off, what is Pareto optimality? Well, if we look at this graph down here, we see that we have butter being produced on the horizontal axis, and we have guns being produced on the vertical axis. The blue line represents the country's ability to produce both goods, and the line itself refers to the production possibilities frontier. In other words, it is the most that can be produced within the country if their resources are being utilized most efficiently. Pareto optimality would be on the blue line. Okay, so for any particular point, any particular mix of guns and butter, in order for it to be Pareto optimal, it has to be on the line itself. If it isn't, for example, like point A, then this is what we call Pareto inefficient. In other words, the economy can produce at A, but it doesn't want to because A is inefficient. It's an inefficient use of our economic resources. So what Pareto optimality refers to is the idea that our economic system is using its resources completely efficiently. And it does so, as you can see, at points B, D, and C. Point X represents a point that is unattainable at current resources. In other words, maybe the economy is able to improve itself over time to where it eventually can achieve X, but right now the only way that this country could achieve X is by trading with another country, and we're not going to worry about that right now. Now, one of the problems with Pareto optimality, as we can see at points B, D, and C, is that it says nothing about efficiency. It says nothing about equity. It only cares about efficiency. So, for example, at point B, gun producers are doing really well, but butter producers aren't doing very well. At point C, the other's true. Butter producers are doing well, but gun producers are not. And then, of course, at point D, we can see that they're both doing reasonably well. What we'll find out is that if we look at the second fundamental welfare theorem of economics, it says that if we are currently at a Pareto optimal position, then we can move to any other Pareto optimal position through redistribution. In other words, if we're at B, the government can actually redistribute the economy in such a way that we move to point D or even to point C. Although at point C, now we're sort of tipping the scales too much in terms of butter. So the way that the government could do this, for example, is the government could tax gun production, taking those proceeds and using it to subsidize butter production. This would cause the economy to produce fewer guns and more butter, and perhaps move us out to D. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is what they should do, all right? This is just an example. But the idea behind the second fundamental welfare theorem is incredibly powerful, because what it allows us to do now is to, in some respects, take the proceeds of a market and then redistribute them in such a way where we actually achieve the highest level of human prosperity. Again, the classical economists and neoclassical economists largely believe that markets did this on their own, that markets were able to achieve human prosperity maximization on its own, didn't need any sort of intervention. However, as we've learned over time, things like endowments, what people start out with in life, really matters. And without ways to redistribute, what happens is that the poor stay poor and the rich just get richer and richer and richer. And this tends to happen over generations. And so families that were poor in the 1700s tend to be poor in the 2000s. Families that tended to be rich in the 1700s tend to be rich in the 2000s. And this raises so many equity concerns. Yes, it might be efficient for that to be the case, but is it really morally equitable for that to be the way in which we allow our economy to organize itself? You may, fall in different places on this particular argument. Economists certainly do. Like I said before, there are still economists who believe that markets do the best job at organizing these particular decisions. And in many respects, this is the main argument for capitalism, right? That capitalism actually gets us to these Pareto optimal outcomes without the need for government intervention. Now, what an economist would say is that's fine, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the Pareto optimal position is where the society actually wants to be. Okay, so for example, B is Pareto optimal, but society may decide that's too many guns. We would rather have fewer guns and more butter. And so again, the government can create policies that over time create these scenarios that cause the economy to move from, say, B to D, or on the other hand, move from C to D. But the key is we want to stay on the blue line, right? We want to stay on the line itself, and that way the economy is remaining completely efficient. So this is sort of the main kind of argument here, is that on top of the fact that we're concerned with efficiency, we also might be concerned with equity. And if we're concerned about equity, then the government now has this role in redistributing the economy in such a way that makes it more equitable. This is incredibly important because it's really the first time in which economists acknowledge the role of policy in making society better off. Both the classical and neoclassical economists largely saw the government as impediments to making society better off, whereas the welfare economists saw, in fact, that there was this real potential for policy to sort of smooth over the edges of a rough society, if you will. This is largely done through what we call the social contract. And the idea behind the social contract is that through democratic political norms, society is able to achieve a robust sense of prosperity by utilizing markets and policy to smooth over the outcomes of those markets. And so we have a long history of doing this in the 1900s and into the 2000s, despite the fact that we have this healthy debate about whether the government is intruding too much into markets, or in fact whether the government is not intruding into markets enough, depending upon where you stand on these particular issues. Environmental economics ultimately is really going to try to remain neutral here, not suggesting that how we necessarily should redistribute or how we should necessarily intrude into markets, but that if we are going to redistribute and if we are going to intrude into markets, then what's the best way to do that? What's the most cost-effective way to do that for society? One of the big important aspects of welfare economics was the creation of what we call the social welfare function. And the social welfare function can be thought of as sort of this governing principle of policy. Imagine that policymakers are attempting to optimize something. In the same way that consumers are optimizing utility and producers are optimizing profits, we can think about policymakers as optimizing a social welfare function. Now, of course, the fact is that the way in which we define the social welfare function ultimately decides the policies that we put forward to achieve that particular goal. Here I have three separate social welfare functions. The first, based largely on John Stuart Mill's version of utilitarianism, in which the social welfare function is simply an aggregate of all consumers' utilities. So you think about the social welfare or social utility function as simply being made up of all the different utilities of all the citizens in a given society. So this is person one, person two, all the way out to the entire population of N, in which the goal is simply to maximize this entire utility function. Now, much like Pareto Optimality, however, the utilitarian view doesn't say much about equity. It doesn't really say much about whether U1 is getting all of the satisfaction and U2 and U3 are getting nothing. Right? That could certainly still maximize the social welfare function, although it's clearly not equitable to do so. In order to achieve some equity in the utilitarian view, we can create what we call a social utilitarian social welfare function. And here, instead of individuals only caring about their own utility, which is true up here, individuals care about their utility and the utility of society. And so now when you maximize utility, not only are you maximizing individual utility, you're also maximizing group utility as well. And so the idea here is that individuals may be willing to, in fact, give up some of their own wealth if it makes society better off. And so again, this goes right back to this argument of redistribution as being a mechanism by which we can make our society sort of more equitable. And this is also probably a more factual view of utility. Certainly people are self-interested, but we also typically see in research that that people also care about society at large. And so the social utilitarian view is probably more proper than the utilitarian view. So economists have sort of increasingly been considering this as the governing principle for policymakers. And then you can kind of take it a next step further, the so-called Rawlsian view of the social welfare function. This was created by John Rawls, who was a social and moral philosopher in the 1900s, who said that the social welfare function should be thought of as simply the minimum of everyone's utility. What I mean by that is that if you look at everybody's different utility, U1, U2, U3, that you look at whichever person has the least amount of utility, the person who has the least level of happiness, the least level of prosperity, and that's the way in which you think about your economy. Okay, up here you're thinking about your economy as just simply trying to maximize some aggregate level of prosperity. With a Rawlsian view, what you're doing is you're defining your social welfare function as the utility of your least well-off individual. And so if your goal is to maximize the social welfare function, then in a Rawlsian view, what you would attempt to do is maximize the utility of your least well-off person. So you can see how the Rawlsian view takes a very sort of strict view on equity. And so if you think about it, you can kind of sort of the equity increases as we go down these utility functions. So the least amount of equity is just a utilitarian view. You get a little bit more equity with a social utilitarian view, and then really the Rawlsian view is very equitable, at least in theory. Sometimes Rawls is associated with the concept of the veil of ignorance, in which the idea is that policymakers should assume that they don't know where they would be in terms of outcomes. They don't know if they're person one, person two, person three. And so the policy that they choose is ignorant of their potential outcomes. The argument here is that policymakers tend to be relatively privileged individuals, and so therefore the policies that they choose oftentimes improve the lives of the already privileged. And we see this time and time again. A Rawlsian view, of course, would not do this. A Rawlsian view would say that In fact, the economy should be far more equitable than it currently is. And so again, I'm not suggesting any one of these is more right or more correct than the other. These are just three different potential, and you could really define any sort of social welfare function in any other way. What's really important here is for us to consider that one aspect of utility is the happiness that individuals gain from the environment, from swimming in lakes, from hiking in forests, so on and so forth. When you start to factor in that individuals in their utility functions care about the environment, now there is this additional policymaker consideration that says that not only do I have to design an economic system that achieves some level of prosperity, regardless of how I define it, but that part of that prosperity will be a maintaining of some level of environmental amenity. In other words, that I don't want to degrade my environment because I know that some people achieve happiness from the environment. And so what we have here now is really sort of the first economic argument for environmental protection. And that's simply stated that since individuals obtain utility from the environment simply by its existence, then any governing principle in terms of policymakers should consider that fact. In other words, instead of just caring about economic growth in terms of human prosperity, policymakers should consider economic growth and environmental protection. This leads us to some interesting things. The first thing is that, as we've already discussed, Pareto Optimality ignores equity. Initial endowments matter. What you start out in life with has a huge impact on where you end up, and if we have an economic system that ignores that fact, then we can't really expect that economic system to ever really be equitable. So if equality is a goal of ours, then redistribution, policy, intrusion into markets is likely required. Second, everything we've said up to this point is only human-focused, or what we call anthropocentric, or in other words, anthropocentrism. This is the idea that humans tend to discount ecological impact. We tend to discount things that aren't human-focused. And clearly with the environment, this can cause a whole host of problems, whether it be deforestation and the destruction of habitat for the animals that live inside of that forest, or whether it's an oil spill, which puts the lives of both flora and fauna at great risk. The other thing is that markets tend to only focus on the here and now and ignore future generations. Humans tend to be myopic, in other words, short-sighted. In other words, we don't really think about the future as much as we probably should. And all of these sort of occur really because of that last point, that the social contract is imperfect. Meaning that the way in which policymakers create policy through a democratic process will never fully achieve an exact sort of replication of preferences. In other words, democratic processes will always leave some people unhappy. Some people will not get their preferred policy position as a law, and therefore it could be the case that the social contract does not achieve full prosperity. This is probably something that we just have to deal with. It's probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to try to seek a perfect social contract, but it is a fact that even with policy, sometimes policy is not achievable because the democratic process doesn't allow it. So even though it could be the case that plenty of people are concerned about environmental protection or the need for it, if they don't have the votes, then it's not going to happen.